JoJo Bizarre Adventures has become somewhat of a cult classic. There is something to be said about a manga that is now on part 8, with part 7 alone being ranked one of the best stories of all time. This is a complete blind review, meaning I have never watched or read any of the JoJo Bizarre Adventures before this review. And even now, the little knowledge I do have about JoJo Bizarre Adventure is only reading part 1. I still have not watched the anime, and I still have no idea what happens next after part 1 of the manga. And while I share about the overall story, I'm trying to keep spoilers at a minimum in case, like me, you've been living under a rock and you haven't either read or have no knowledge about JoJo Bizarre Adventures. Welcome to the GTP. My name is Scott, and my goal is to help you find great experiences for yourself and your family. So let's go ahead and dive into this part 1 review of JoJo Bizarre Adventures Phantom Blood. Now, part 1 came out in 1987, and it's only 3 volumes, but do not be fooled, as these 3 volumes are chock full of content. And as I was reviewing this series, I kept in mind that what happened in 1987 might not transition as well to today, and that I can't necessarily flaw a manga for how it was written so long ago. First off, can we talk about how nice these hardcovers are? I love how glossy is the front. These feel really good to hold in your hand. This media has done a great job with the production of these hardcovers. So let's go ahead and talk about the overall story of JoJo Bizarre Adventures Part 1, Phantom Blood. The prologue of the story shares the tale of an ancient mask that can give eternal life from extracting the lifeblood of others. Quickly, we're moved on, and the story takes us to the late 1800s in London. The young character Dio is watching his father, who is close to dying from sickness. Dio's father shares on his deathbed, who is a common criminal, of course, shares how a very wealthy family owes him a favor and gives his son a letter to go seek the Joestars as his dying wish. We are next introduced to Jonathan Joestar, who is around the same age as Dio. Jonathan is the next heir to the Joestar family fortune. Dio then comes to the Joestar family, and he's quickly accepted in as being part of the family. And what starts to unravel the story is a simple good versus evil as you watch Dio and then now his brother around the same age, Jonathan, grow up together in the same family. It just so happens that the mask from the prologue is on display in the Joestar's home as a piece of art. Once Dio discovers the powers from the mask, he decides to wield that power and destroy everything in his path. And that becomes so true to even destroying the Joestars, who have been nothing but kind, loving, and caring to Dio this entire time. So let's go ahead and talk about the 2 main characters of the story, where it's interesting that in some regards it's almost like you have 2 protagonists. And the first part of the story really focuses on Dio and his backstory, and then Jonathan Joestar becomes kind of like a side character. In the later half of the story, it actually flips, where Jonathan Joestar, we're focusing more on his character, and Dio has become not necessarily a side character, but now the main villain of our story. So let's start with Dio, who is straight up evil. At the start of the story, I genuinely thought we were going to see Dio go from disliking Joestar to quickly becoming friends and then brothers. Instead, Dio is a continuous, calculated monster. At the very start, Dio even kicks Jonathan's beloved dog in front of him for no reason other than psychologically torture Joestar. The animal cruelty was a little hard to stomach, and I wasn't prepared to read that right in the first chapter. I was a little surprised to see this much of hate and meanness from Dio right out of the gate in this story. Jonathan is a terrific protagonist who stands up for what is right no matter the cost. He is smart, he is kind, and he loves Dio as a brother, even though Dio does nothing but makes his life miserable. Jonathan is constantly dealt a crappy hand, yet Jonathan always chooses to do what is right. Jonathan, who we ought to inspire to be when we are faced with tough circumstances. I can choose to take the easy road, get bitter, start cutting corners, or I can choose to take the hard road, be grateful for what I have, and do what is right even when it's unfair. And that's something I absolutely love about Jonathan. So I actually want to peek back a little more, and this story actually reminded me of the hero's journey. And if you haven't heard of the hero's journey before, let me give you a little insight into what that looks like. This story is very similar to the hero's journey, and that's okay. Some of the best stories we know and love use the path of the hero's journey, such as Star Wars. And the first part of that path is a character, Jonathan being the main character, which deals with a problem, which is Dio, who starts to destroy everything in Jonathan's life and the lives of others. Next on the path, Jonathan meets a guide who gives him a plan by teaching him a new power called Haman. That calls Jonathan to action to fight against the power Dio has obtained in the mask and to stop Dio, which results in, well, we'll hold that off so we don't go into spoilers. The Haman breathing technique in JoJo, which is his source and strength of power, actually reminded me of the similar breathing technique we see in Demon Slayer. It actually would not surprise me if JoJo had some inspiration and influence, and the story has almost a comic book feel. As soon as Jonathan learns of his new power, all of a sudden a villain henchman appears that you know is easily going to get destroyed from Jonathan's new power. It was kind of like if all of a sudden Luke Skywalker got into a fight with a stormtrooper. You also literally see an anvil fall on someone's head. It nearly kills him, but it's an anvil nonetheless, similar to a cartoon. And the story at times has some MacGyver type of vibes to it. All of a sudden, a character reveals that he's traveled around the world and he learned some tip from the Eskimos in the Arctic. This character, keep in mind, is from the 1800s, who is living in the slums, but all of a sudden you find out he's a world traveler. Or, while a character is underwater, all of a sudden he remembers, wait a minute, I learned in school that some rocks have oxygen underneath, and if I just lift through some of those rocks, I bet I can find some oxygen bubbles that can keep me sustained while I'm underwater. Definitely MacGyver type of feeling and moments. It's funny that in these MacGyver type of moments, that logic is introduced in those situations where a character lets you know, hey, I either read that once in a textbook, or you know what, I saw it in the zoo, and that's why I know this to be true. It was also interesting on a MacGyver type of moment that all of a sudden they were able to create a glider out of leaves to get to safety. Who would have thought, indeed? There is also an interesting alternative history on chapter 24, turning Queen Elizabeth into a tyrant against Mary of Scots. I ended up doing some research and did see that there was a Mary who was a threat to Queen Elizabeth. And this Mary was put on trial and found for treason. I thought this was very creative. It also would be good to point out to young readers that JoJo does have some alternative history, and this is not fact. Hopefully by young readers seeing a warrior wield a sword by his hair will give it off that this isn't true, but just keep in mind this is an alternative view of history. This is not true. It did not really happen that way. But it is cool to see the author added that layer to the story. This is a story at times is best if you can just leave your brain to the side and just enjoy the story for what it is. If you do decide to leave your brain in and try to think logically about the story, you're not going to enjoy the wild and fun ride that it is. I mean, it does have the name Bizarre in the title, and bizarre indeed is the overall story. So let's go ahead and talk about the dialogue of the story. And the story does have some very heavy dialogue moments. I don't mind that for myself, but I do know that is a turn off for some people who read manga, as they don't enjoy reading manga that is very wordy, and at times, at least part 1 is very wordy. The dialogue has its moments when sometimes it's stating the obvious. It felt at times like I was reading what would have been an old cartoon show from the early 90s, which is understandable when written in 1987. And at times it felt more for kids than teens. But then there are dialogue and panels that are definitely not for kids. A bizarre dialogue experience indeed. And I felt bad for the character who I loved, Mr. Speedwagon, as it felt at times his only job in the story was to be a commentator on what was going on between the different panels. It reminded me similar to a commentary that you would see broadcasting telling you about what was going on at a sporting event. It is interesting, in the middle of a fight, we hear commentary on the backstory of some of the characters as all of a sudden, Mr. Speedwagon is a major history buff. Some of Speedwagon's descriptions are downright hilarious and entertaining, such as his face is no longer twisted with hatred. It's the peaceful face of a boy conversing with his mother. Or Mr. Speedwagon's commentary saying, that is more horror than frog piss. Frog piss? Now, I've never experienced that myself. My guess it's horrid, but it was entertaining to see that was the description he used for that situation. So let's go ahead and talk about the artwork of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 1. Now, I was actually thoroughly impressed with the panels as they are very detailed. It took some used to how the bodies are drawn with the giant muscles that wouldn't be normal. But I did appreciate the unique art style and the attention to detail from the author. You can almost feel a little overwhelmed by the panels as there is so much detail in the background. The author really took his time on this masterpiece, and I'm excited to read the other parts to see how the author grew when it came to his art style and design. So what are some life lessons we actually can take from part 1 of JoJo's Bizarre Adventures? And the biggest life lesson I think we can take from this story is from Jonathan's father himself. How powerful that Joestar's father teaches to seek to understand. Instead of writing someone off as bad, Joestar asks the question, why is that person so mean? I wonder what happened to his life to be so cruel to others. Hurt people hurt people. Often people who lash out at others are dealing with some of the deepest pains themselves. In life, you need to seek to understand what might be going on behind the scenes with someone else. I wonder why they behave that way. I wonder why they're so short-tempered. I wonder why they're so mean. Instead of just casting off to the side, we need to seek to understand that maybe there's something going on behind the scenes that we don't fully understand, and that's the reason why they're lashing out and they're mean to others. Seek to understand, why is it that they feel the need to steal? Why do they feel the need to lie and not tell the truth? What is really going on besides that person? And instead of just saying, yep, that person's a liar, yep, that person is bad, maybe they've been dealt a crappy hand. Maybe they learned the habit of lying because they've been constantly lied to themselves from their family. So the only way they know how to get out of the situation is through that habit of lying, because that's what was modeled to them when they were younger. So again, hurt people hurt people. And I love seeing Jonathan Joestar's father seek to understand each time, how can I care about that person? How can I assume the very best of that individual, even though everyone else sees them as a liar, a criminal, a no good? How can I still love that person? We never know what someone has gone through until we first seek to understand. And I love seeing how Jonathan's father impresses that on his son to seek to understand Dio, even though behind the scenes, as we peel back the curtain of Dio, we see that he really is just a pure, evil, calculated monster who in fact was dealt a crappy hand, did have a bad family life from the start, which may have caused some of the inner workings in him to become the monster that he becomes as you watch the story unfold. So let's talk about the age rating of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 1. And the manga is rated T for teen. Think of it kind of like a PG-13 movie, and I do agree with that assessment, as there are times of violence, animal cruelty, and a few curse words here and there, but overall, it wasn't that too bad when it comes to the age rating, and I would be comfortable with a 13-year-old myself reading this story. So let's go ahead and talk about the GTP rating for JoJo Bizarre Adventures Phantom Blood Part 1. I did not expect the ending of the story. If the story ended how I thought it was going to go, I was actually leaning towards a lower score. I caught myself at the edge of my seat and was actually sitting up from my bed as I was reading the last chapter. The story ultimately is a good versus evil. With that said, I will be giving Part 1 a GTP rating of 7 out of 10. It was a fun story. It is bizarre indeed. But the manga does say on the cover, Bizarre Adventure. So you kind of know what you're getting into when you start the story. And after seeing the ending of Part 1, I'm really looking forward to checking out and reading Part 2 of the overall story. So that's my take on JoJo Bizarre Adventures Part 1. In the comments below, would you mind sharing what do you think of JoJo Bizarre Adventures Part 1? And if you'd like to see more content like this, would you like, comment, and subscribe to the channel? That way you can help us as we grow this small community together. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.